This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets for you. So we saw an interesting, shall we say, cautious response from South Africa's investment community on the day that the medium-term budget statement was delivered in South Africa. The currency had a relatively positive response of about 1.6% in the wake of that particular budget. JSE top 40 year-to-date gains essentially around 14.7%, but a lot of that has been driven by gains in the mining majors. Anglo-American up nearly 6% today, Pallet Platinum 7%, Gold Fleets up about 5% as well. In East Africa, an interesting decline on Centum. That was down about 8.8% today, essentially turning negative on a year-to-date basis. Here's what's coming up tonight. Boeing has reached a compensation deal with the families of the Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX crash victims. We'll have details and reactions. Major donors unlock $10 billion to fund renewable energy in the developing world. And President Xi's calling for more cooperation and inclusiveness within APEC. The details on those stories and plenty more will be coming up in the course of the program. Now then, let's start in the world of aviation. The American plane manufacturer Boeing has struck a settlement with the families of the 157 people who died in the Ethiopia 737 MAX crash in March 2019. According to court documents, the company has accepted liability for their debts. In return, the families of the victims will not be pursuing punitive damages from the firm. Lawyers for the victims' families say that Boeing can still be held fully accountable all the same. They see this agreement as a significant milestone. The agreement opens the way for families outside the United States, in countries like Ethiopia and in Kenya, to claim compensation through the American justice system, as opposed to doing so in their home countries, which might be more difficult and result in lower payouts. Initially, shares in Boeing dropped by about 1% to about $218.50 following that announcement. But at 17:13 GMT, the planemaker shares were just over 1% higher to 20.77 was the price. Some hours ago, I spoke to CGTN's Koleto Anjohi in Addis Ababa for a reaction.
Well, we are yet to get an official, at least, statement from Ethiopian Airlines, if it will give a statement, although we know for so long it has tried to dissociate with it and saying that Boeing needs to handle this. But from the various victims, or relatives of victims that we've been talking to here and there, they say it's kind of a walk towards closure, something, at least something that gives assurance that somebody has listened to them and somebody is taking responsibility. Well, the biggest challenge will be, I believe, it will be how the relatives will be able to access, for example, or go through the U.S. Courts to get their compensation, to decide whether to do settlement or whether to go to do trials. That might be where the challenge is. But so far, there is some sense of relief that at least somebody has given them a bit of closure.
Colette, as we understand it, as part of this settlement, no executive in Boeing is basically being held personally responsible for the decisions that essentially led to making a flawed aircraft, putting that into the market, and of course leading to the crashes that we saw in Thailand and eventually in Ethiopia in March 2019. How do the victims' families feel about this?
I think, Rama, if we look at it on the reality perspective, I mean, very few people would know the executives of the big company. Very few people would care, probably, if executive A or B or C is mentioned. People are looking at the company as Boeing, you know. So when they are talking about Boeing has not done this for us, then Boeing is ignoring us, Boeing needs to do better, then they were looking at the company as Boeing. So now that Boeing itself as a company has been made to come to book for different people, depending on how they'll choose to settle this, then it kind of still gives them some sort of comfort and some sort of decision on how to forge forward. And they might have to now start inquiring, maybe get more legal services, maybe get more legal guidance on how to go about it. Just the fact that Boeing, the company, has been mentioned in this, I think is quite a relief for many.
Okay, so one last question for you. Where does this leave Ethiopian Airlines? The carrier had ordered about 20 of these 737 MAX jets. Will it continue to fly them in the future?
we foresee that because at least in around September, the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines hinted that they are thinking of putting back the aeroplanes back on air, probably next year, sometime next year, maybe early next year. That's what he said. And we know that by the time of the accident, they had 4 that were forced to be grounded. That is apart from the one that got an accident. So yes, they will. If we are to go by what he said in September, then yes, they will continue, and the partnership continues. In August, they signed a memorandum of understanding with Boeing, Ethiopian Airlines and Boeing, to assist Ethiopia or support Ethiopian Airlines to have what it called one of the biggest and advanced hubs of aviation hubs of Africa. And this MOU entailed things like Boeing would support in industrial development, advanced aviation training and all that. So yes, Boeing has been a partner of Ethiopian Airlines for a long time, and now that this has been done and they kind of settled it out of court, the two companies, then yes, they will continue to work together, and yes, we shall see. We are bound to see those planes up again in the air.
Let's move on to South Africa now. The National Treasury over there has pledged to trim the fiscal deficit and tackle public debt in its medium-term budget statement. Now, it also adds it will not commit to net long-term spending, despite a bit of a windfall coming through from higher commodity prices. This comes as South Africa's economy, the most industrialized in Africa, is bouncing back strongly this year, following a rise in global demand for commodities. Treasury adds that it will stick to a fairly disciplined fiscal strategy and set a new target of narrowing the fiscal deficit to just under 5% by the 2024-2025 fiscal year. It's also forecasting GDP growth of just over 5% this year. Compare that to the February forecast of 3.3%. Other news from South Africa as well. Former South African President Friedrich Willem de Klerk has died at the age of 85. Following his battle with cancer, de Klerk was the last apartheid-era white president to lead the country. He's described as having played a key role in negotiating a peaceful transfer of power to a black-led government under Nelson Mandela. For his work in dismantling the racist white minority rule in the country, he was jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize with Mandela in 1993. On to Egypt now. The state-run digital payments infrastructure and fintech platform e-Finance has floated nearly a quarter of its shares on the Egyptian exchange in the fourth quarter of this year. Now, the offering included a private placement to certain institutional investors in Egypt and around the world, and a retail offering in Egypt too. In addition to processing about 2.1 trillion Egyptian pounds, that's about $134 billion in government transactions, e-Finance offers a wider range of digital services through its subsidiaries. Yasser Hakim takes a look at the IPO and its impact on the stock market in North Africa.
The Egyptian Stock Exchange has suffered poor performance and reduced volumes since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in March 2020. However, things have begun looking up since the initial public offer by e-Finance in the last week of October. While most companies delayed their IPOs since 2020, fearing market volatility, e-Finance's CEO Ibrahim Sarhan chose the opposite direction.
We were afraid like the other companies in the last few months, but we changed our minds completely and took the decision after our roadshow where we met 120 investment funds, corporates and foreign investment banks. We found that they had a big appetite. They confirmed to us that they will join in and buy huge numbers of shares. We discovered we are on solid ground to enter the stock exchange with confidence.
The state-owned fintech company's share price jumped by 79% on its debut, achieving a market cap of $2.1 billion, the largest IPO in the North African country since 2015. The positive impact on the Egyptian Stock Exchange was clear, with private placement a record-breaking 7 times oversubscribed and retail offering oversubscribed 61 times.
True, there was a slowdown in trade, low volumes, low liquidity, and no investor appetite to pump new funding into the market before. But this IPO has strengthened the performance of the market, added new products, therefore attracting new investors, and this could open the door for more diversification in the market.
What was pleasing for officials is that 72% of the allocation came from foreign investors, who had shied away from the market since last year. But what are the future plans for e-Finance?
We want to make the best use of the capital raised for the benefit of shareholders, and we are keen to multiply our results so that our shares remain a leader in the market. We have a plan. First, we will focus on growth for the tech companies that are already part of our group. There are 5 subsidiaries and another 2 newly formed companies, eTax and eHealth. Plus, we will expand into other sectors, transportation and tourism.
On the back of the success of the e-finance IPO, the Egyptian government has said that it will go forward with the release of 5 state-owned companies and banks in the Egyptian Stock Exchange in the first half of 2022. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in Kenya. Plans are reportedly underway to raise $1 billion in debt to buy a stake in an oil project operated by Tullow Oil and its partners. But that's likely to happen next year. The debt's expected to be used as an equity injection in Kenya's oil company, NOC, in order to fund its portion of the project, which includes a heated pipeline. Once complete, the project will include a pipeline to the coast for exports and an estimated output of about 120,000 barrels a day, with expected gross oil recovery of 585 million barrels over the full life of the field. The European Investment Bank and Alliance of Global Investors have rolled out the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund. It's in a public and private partnership with the governments of Germany and Luxembourg. Now, this facility aims to support climate-focused projects active in emerging markets that will focus on climate mitigation, climate adaptation and access to electricity in developing countries. The clothing retailer Fucini Group has posted a rebound in its performance. Retail turnover is up by nearly 52% to $1.24 billion after the 6 months ending at the end of September. In a statement, the group explained that its turnover growth was aided by market share gains, the expansion of its physical footprint and brand portfolio, as well as growth in online retail sales too. Now, the company's total revenue for the period is over $1.3 billion. Gross earnings went up by 6% to $610 million. Headline earnings per share was up 572% to 26 US cents. And finally, the Tesla CEO Elon Musk has sold shares worth an estimated $5 billion in the company. That comes days after he went to Twitter and asked his 63 million followers over there whether he should sell 10% of the shares that he holds in the company. Shares in Tesla were down around 16% in the 2 days after the poll came out in favor of him selling the shares, before regaining some ground a little later on Wednesday. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore a plan to raise at least $100 billion over a decade to fund renewable energy in developing economies. And Ghana's charting a new path in the automotive industry in order to reduce car imports. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra.
Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Now, enabling developing countries to bypass, or at least greatly reduce their use of fossil fuels and move into using a lot more renewables is arguably one of the biggest technology transfer challenges that the planet has ever faced. Now, the aim is to help countries to deploy clean tech, tapping into solar, wind, hydrogen, greener steel in a democratization, as it were, of environmentally friendly know-how. One scheme launched at COP26 is the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is a backing of a range of organizations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, a string of development banks, including the African Development Bank, the furniture store IKEA, and Jeff Bezos' Earth Fund. Energy-poor countries currently account for roughly 24% of global emissions. All right, then, so let's explore this plan in a bit more detail, especially with respect to how it affects countries here in Africa. Joseph Nganga is Executive Director of the Africa Power and Climate Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. He joins us now live on the program. Joseph, good to see you. So, developed economies failed to deliver on their pledge to raise about $100 billion in funding, essentially for climate mitigation, climate adaptation some years ago. Given that context, why will this succeed? What's different this time around?
Hello, Rama, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the difference here is the group of participants and the approach. So the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, and the IKEA Foundation have come together to put together $1.5 billion towards this incredibly challenging set of issues, and they are climate, jobs, and electrification. The reason we think this is a working formula is the fact that there's significant alignment amongst the institutions that are part of this alliance in terms of our missions, in terms of our resources, and in terms of the opportunities on the continent that could use these funds to really address those three items.
All right, then. So the opportunity clearly is there, but ultimately it's still going to come back down to a question of cost, isn't it? Because for a lot of the consumers that we're targeting in, say, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, the cost of energy is a key significant determinant in what energy source, what fuel they end up with. So for this to work, that renewable energy has to be relatively cheap.
Absolutely, and I prefer to use affordable rather than cheap because cheap has certain implications. But the reality is there are three factors that drive the cost of electrification. It's the technology, it's the infrastructure around it, and it's the cost of money, the return requirement by investors. Today, we are seeing the technology at a point where it's incredibly competitive relative to existing fossil fuel technologies. Infrastructure, we are seeing a lot of work around efficient grids, appropriate storage, which address the technological challenge. The other piece is the cost of money, and the cost of money is a function of risk, perceived risk, and availability of the investments. What we are doing with the Alliance is using philanthropic capital that's incredibly flexible to unlock the resources that would require a certain return, and by so doing, lower the return expectation and therefore drive lower the cost of electrification and large-scale adoption.
But aren't we talking about some tech here that really hasn't been deployed at scale? For example, if you're talking about storage, I mean, battery tech at this particular point hasn't gotten to the point where grid storage is a functional reality in our part of the world. And as far as grids are concerned, I mean, we are familiar with all the problems with national grids in several countries. In Nigeria, for example, where just getting power from point A to point B is pretty difficult. How would those problems be solved?
It's a very good question, and I will point you to the solar part of the technology challenge. 5 years ago, we would have said the same thing about solar on the continent. I think we were seeing investors asking for north of 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour to install solar farms. Today in Kenya, there are solar farms that are being built for 7 cents a kilowatt hour. Similarly for storage, while we are seeing that it's still quite expensive, the significant improvements in technology, the large-scale adoption of grid-level storage capacity are all driving the cost down. And I'm happy to hear you mention Nigeria. Nigeria presents a particularly interesting case studies in that you have distribution companies that have huge territories that they cannot address. And what we're seeing there is the marrying of their existing infrastructure with the mini-grid technology, which lends itself to solar installation, to storage, to localized grids, which in combination drive affordability and provide a more accessible solution in terms of electrification.
Just in terms of affordability, let's use your description for this. In terms of affordability, yes, the grid solar power, the grid connected solar power plants may be selling it into the grid at 7 US cents, but on the retail end, if that power is being sold on at, say, 20 US cents, I mean, are you really going to hit that target of expanding access to clean renewable power? Do you have a target price in mind?
So I think the question we should be asking is, what's the alternative? Today, if you're running a diesel generator in your factory, you're probably paying north of 30 cents a kilowatt hour. If you're getting electricity from the grid, 20 cents is not as cheap or as competitive as we would like it, but it's much better than running your own diesel generator. So I think there's a path towards lower tariffs for consumers, transitioning from self-generation, if you may call it that, to being on the grid and having more people have access to either mini grids or grids. That being said, I do agree with you that for industries to be competitive, for households to afford power and to use that power for things like cooking, which then protects the environment from deforestation and so on, the tariff needs to come down further. How do we think that will happen? Part of it is economies of scale. The more people you have on the grid, the larger the network, the more you spread out the costs of running that grid and therefore lower that cost. Second is further technology innovation. So solar today may be at 7 cents, but we anticipate that will keep declining as technology improves. So yes, at 20 cents, it's an improvement from self-generation, but it could do even better. And I anticipate that as there's a larger scale adoption of energy electrification, those costs should really come down even further. But I also want to point out, Ramah, that it's not just about the cents per kilowatt hour. It's also reliability. It's incredibly important that factories, households, schools, hospitals all have reliable power. Why? Because if they don't, then it means they have to install self-generation to complement what's on the grid. So it's really a combination of driving affordability and reliability to make large-scale adoption and to make this a valuable resource to the communities on the continent.
Indeed. Well, it's an ambitious 10-year plan. Let's see how it plays out. We'll certainly check in with you along the journey. Joseph Nyang from the Rockefeller Foundation. Now then, phasing out fossil fuels is one of the key demands, one of the key stories really in the COP26 climate change conference this year. But this is a challenge for South Africa. It's the world's 7th largest producer and consumer of coal. In this installment of Panorama Africa, CGTN visits the country. It's Africa's most industrialized in order to explore the impact of coal-fired power and the potential of Sino-African cooperation in renewable power.
Emissions from fossil fuels are the dominant cause of global warming. Phasing them out has become a global priority. In this episode of Panorama Africa, we're in one of the most fossil fuel dependent countries in the world, South Africa, where we take a look at the impact of the coal mining sector as the country's transition to renewable energy slowly gathers pace. Coal-fired electricity has lit up homes and powered the South African economy since the late 19th century. At the time, coal was plentiful and cheap. It has since become one of the most climate-costly energy sources yet, leaving a tainted legacy in its wake.
After they've extracted the coal, destroyed the environment, destroyed all our water sources, they disappeared. And here we are sitting with an environmental liability of which we pay with our health and our lives.
The city of Emalahleni, meaning place of coal, is the heart of South Africa's coal mining sector. Situated in Mpumalanga province, it holds the largest concentration of coal mines and coal power plants in the country. Each year, new mines open up, bringing them closer and closer to where low-income communities live.
Sihlukumezeke kakhulu ngale mayini. Ayisalali nasebusuku imishini igijima waya. I-dust yona ngisakhuluma ngayo ngoba sihlala phakathi kwayo. Every day uvuka kune-dust. Kusho ukuthi vele siphefumula yona, sidla yona, vele sesiphila yona. If ungacheka manje abantwana bethu, amehlo abo sewabovu kabuhlungu kwangathi abantu abadala ababhemayo abaphuzayo. Yaba affecta kakhulu lento le.
Of significance is the coal-related air pollution that is causing respiratory problems, including asthma in children.
Uqala kwa princess ukuze ngibone ukuthi bekane asthma. Waba ne-flu ngamisa esibhedlela akakhoni ukuphefumula kahle. Izinhliziyo zami ibuhlungu kakhulu ngoba angisiboni isidingo sawo la mayini because asibenefit next kibo because abantwana bayagula izindlu ziyamosheka. So la mayini shuthi lakithi alese just ukugula kuphela.
Local residents say they feel exploited at the expense of coal mining companies and the country's economy. Homes are easily damaged by the vibration of heavy machinery and blasting that accompanies coal mining. Homeowners have been left frustrated and desperate. In a cruel irony, the informal settlements that lie in the shadows of power stations do not have electricity. To cook food and warm their homes, many residents opt to dig for leftover inferior coal from the discarded mine dumps that sit above sinkholes. It's a risky undertaking.
And then murepa malatho go botlhoko ka re nthwela go phoshomela maphelo a batho a ya fela and le mo maoto re swele ka lebaka la re go tloga semoko se segolo ge le rwa yepa go tla malatlha mantši o fetsa go tsena go bala batho bantši.
The implementation of environmental regulations and the rehabilitation of coal fields has been inconsistent, causing many serious problems to the ecosystem. The consequences are being felt years later, even where mines have long closed.
This sinkhole is plus minus 30 meters deep. It is very dangerous because in some instances there are people who died because of these sinkholes. They are very deep, and where we are, it's informal, there's no electricity, at night it's very dark. Anything can happen.
The water system has also been affected by the old coal mining sites. Matthews has lived in Mpumalanga most of his life and has seen the lingering damage of this industry.
We are standing just in front of evaporation ponds. We call them acid mine drainage evaporation ponds from the old mine shafts, coal mine shafts. It contains heavy metals, dissolved heavy metals, such as zinc, such as copper, aluminum, and so forth. But what is worse, this water is untreated. It flows into the river untreated and mixes with the water in the river and consumed by community members down the stream.
Coal mining in Emalahleni started in 1896. Over a century later, the effects are still being felt by communities in the soil they live on, the water they drink, and the air they breathe.
The coal mining industry is not sustainable at all. It's about time that South Africans wake up and we need to smell the coffee and say alternatives, renewable energy, wind turbines, solar panels, agroecology must be key.
South Africa is the world's 7th largest producer and consumer of coal in the world, yielding an average of 224 million tons of coal each year. The country exports roughly 28% of this, but the majority, 72%, is sold domestically, firing up the power stations of the state-owned electricity provider, Eskom. Africa's biggest carbon emitter of greenhouse gases is feeling the pressure to retire its aging fleet of coal-fired power stations and seize investments in new coal projects. An announcement earlier this year from Chinese President Xi Jinping may help propel South Africa's efforts.
China will step up support for other developing countries in developing green and low-carbon energy, and will not build new coal-fired power projects abroad.
According to the CEO of Eskom, the announcement is in line with the state power utility's own shifting objectives.
We cannot disguise the fact that Eskom is in fact a very large emitter, not only of carbon, but also of sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, as well as particulate matter. And we therefore have a duty to clean up the environment. The best way to protect the health and also to create future job opportunities and stimulate the economic environment in Mpumalanga is precisely to engender this just energy transition.
South Africa's just transition includes decommissioning coal mines, creating new jobs for mine workers, investing in renewable energy, and ultimately achieving a net zero emissions target by 2050. In South Africa's Western Cape province, a unique partnership between South African firm BTE Renewables and Chinese firm Goldwinds highlights the potential of China-Africa cooperation in the renewable energy sector. Barely a year old, the Excelsior wind farm in Swellendam is contributing clean energy directly into Eskom's national grid.
2020 December, we begin to production. We calculate we have benefit around 20,000 families per year. So that is very promising.
The Excelsior wind farm hopes to be a positive addition to this community, providing power as well as jobs and social development.
Goldwind, they have a policy that they only want people from the community, the local communities. They supply the jobs, and then I can sort my family out. I can provide for my family.
This is a rural school, and most of the kids come from farms around the school, and the parents and all the kids fall under low economic circumstances. They live with the basics. When BTE and Goldwin invest in our school, we will be able to get our learners to universities and to higher education institutions. And I think it will also have a great impact on our community.
True to China's own climate agenda, companies like Goldwinds serve as catalysts to Africa's green transition.
We always focus on the clean energy, and our main goals is from China and benefit the world. We do a lot of projects all over the world, and we are willing to helping the countries who focus on the clean energy.
For South Africa, breaking the coal dependency cycle is crucial for the climate and the health of communities.
We now have a very special video to share with you.
At this year's COP26 summit, the country's president announced an $8.5 billion deal to help end its reliance on coal and meet its 2050 climate pledge.
Bold action must start with accelerated decarbonization of our energy systems. This involves harnessing new technologies to reduce our dependence on high-emission fossil fuels, including unabated coal power.
By 2050, we will have between 78 and 85% renewable energy sources installed. some limited natural gas. There could be some legacy coal in that mix, but our forecasts are for a massive migration to renewable energy sources.
Coal has been a critical commodity in Africa, but its benefits are far outweighed by the cost to the environment and communities. But through key partnerships and with the abundant supply of wind and sun, Africa is uniquely positioned to transition to renewable energy, bringing power and progress to Africa for a clean and resilient future. Lindy Mtongana, CGTN, South Africa.
Right, and let's build on that story. Barely a week ago, South African officials announced they'd agreed to an $8.5 billion package of grants and concessional finance to pay for part of the cost of retiring some of the country's coal power plants, which you've just seen in Lindy's piece there. But given what we've seen so far, does that amount of money go far enough? I explore that with Jude Moore. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Before that, he was Liberia's Minister for Public Works between 2014 and 2018.
Despite the small number that we saw in South Africa, it still provides a precedent that other countries can come to the global partners with and say, we want a deal similar to South Africa. It may not be the same numbers, but I think it's a really, really good start.
All right, let me wrap this up by putting a scenario to you. Let's assume that COP26 is basically a replay of Paris in 2015 and the funding doesn't come through. So African governments basically are operating on their own. What are the top 3 things that they need to focus on in terms of adaptation and mitigation as far as climate change is concerned?
The World Meteorological Organization released a report that showed that there are 2 threats that are going to be very, very prevalent on the continent. The first is going to be drought. We're going to see significant drought across the continent, I mean from east to west to south, and even in the north. So more than 60% of the population of the continent is dependent on some form of agriculture. That agriculture is usually not irrigated, it's rain-fed. And so any disruption to the climate has significant impact on livelihoods. That drought is going to lead to famines. We're seeing a climate-induced famine currently in Madagascar. And so the first thing is to be able to do adaptation. First, research on crops that are drought resistant. You definitely need that, especially for the staples that we eat.
And they have, the governments have to own that intellectual property as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. If they need to find a way to cut spending in other areas so that they can be able to direct spending in that. But so that this is very important because again, if someone else has the intellectual property, it puts us at a disadvantage. The second thing that the report notes is there's going to be, because of the failure of the rains and because of the droughts, then when the rains do come, the rains are going to be so ferocious, they're going to lead to flooding. So that's the next thing. We need to build infrastructure that can withstand flooding, right? So now it's not just, in the past when we did infrastructure, I was Minister of Infrastructure, the primary criteria was cost. Now we have to go beyond cost. We need to build infrastructure that can withstand flooding. And so it means that the infrastructure we built may not always be the cheapest, but it has to be the one that can last the longest. We see that, we're looking at FOCAC to see what China decides. Well, there has been a decline, a noticeable decline in Chinese lending, right? And what we are perceiving as sort of China is no longer as open to African risk, that the appetite has been abated. What does that mean going forward? Because China is such an important part of our infrastructure financing. So after FOCAC, we will see. But I think for African governments looking to build climate resilient infrastructure, China is going to be an important part of that. Now we see that B3W is, they're thinking about doing projects, supposedly 10 projects in the new year. We'll see what those projects are. The global connectivity from the EU. I think African governments, it is really, really important for them to be able to establish or at least pursue a diversity in sources of financing. But agriculture infrastructure are going to be the two core places in responding to the climate crisis.
Let's move on to Ghana now. It's charting a new path in its automotive sector. The country wants to move away from a reliance on car imports, often second-hand, in order to boost its domestic manufacturing and assembly capacity. Volkswagen is one of the automobile giants that have set up an assembly plant over there as the government opens up to investors in the automotive space. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Volkswagen launched its assembly plants in Accra last year. It says it has already trained many locals in the assembling and production of cars.
This transfer of knowledge or transfer of technology has been working well, and you see that we transfer this knowledge to people and they are becoming much more better, and it is also helping us to improve standards in automotive industry.
Vehicles are among the top 3 goods imported in Ghana. The government developed an automotive policy in 2019 to drive growth in its industrial economy and also create jobs for young people.
The automotive market in Africa is small compared to that of China and Europe, but Ghana wants to position the country as a hub for making cars in West Africa.
The government is giving incentives to car makers, including tax waivers. It has also increased import taxes on new and used cars to make people consider buying locally assembled vehicles. Still, the domestic industry says more needs to be done to make it easy for people in Ghana to buy the cars.
Good financial support for the customers, like auto loan, as we say. This is very important to have the auto loan. I mean, everywhere you go around the world, 99% of the people, whatever is their standard in the society, use the auto loans to buy their cars, and they don't, hardly anybody go and buy cash. And unfortunately in Ghana, we're still not so much ready for that.
Ghana is the 5th Volkswagen vehicle assembly location in sub-Saharan Africa, after South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria and Rwanda. As the demand for cars in Africa grows, VW says it wants to tap into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to create other markets for manufacturing car parts.
We are looking at creating a value chain between the neighboring countries or within the region, because not necessarily that we are producing everywhere. So we will have Ghana having an assembly plant here, also another country producing something like a component for materials required to use for production of the cars or assembly here.
While the coronavirus pandemic has affected VW's target of assembling 5,000 cars locally in Ghana in the first phase this year, it says it is building its capacity to produce up to 20,000 cars annually in the second phase. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. President Xi is calling for more cooperation and inclusiveness within APEC. And the US President is in Baltimore pitching improvements to ports ahead of the signing of $1 trillion infrastructure bill.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
Welcome back to the program. China's President Xi Jinping says that the Asia-Pacific region is facing what he describes as a once-in-a-century test that's crucial to the future of humanity. While addressing an online APEC summit, Xi urged members to face today's challenges like COVID and climate change while calling for more cooperation and inclusiveness. Owen Poland has this report.
Supporting Indigenous populations is a key theme of APEC 2021. And China's president says APEC economies need to be forward-looking and reject practices of discrimination and exclusion.
Attempts to draw ideological lines or form small circles on geopolitical grounds are bound to fail. The Asia-Pacific region cannot and should not relapse into the confrontation and division of the Cold War era.
New Zealand's Prime Minister also believes that the Asia-Pacific region can build back better and emerge from the COVID pandemic stronger and more resilient than ever.
Now, every crisis does present an opportunity, and the 21 APEC economies have been dealt a heavy burden, but also an opportunity to strike an economic reset on a scale we haven't seen since World War II.
Ardern says that APEC has also shown a determination to work together and to reject protectionism.
This year, all APEC economies have worked to make trade easier as we battle the pandemic.
APEC fully supports moves toward a more digital economy, especially when it comes to cross-border customs procedures. But Australia's Prime Minister wants tougher rules to prevent hacking, terrorist activities and cyberbullying on social media platforms.
And we can't have digital platforms providing a shield for people to engage in online abuse, because if we allow that to happen, digital platforms will not be a safe space for consumers, for our children.
But one of the biggest issues at this online summit is climate change, and China has pledged to lead the world in becoming carbon neutral before 2030.
China will strike a balance between low-carbon transition and ensuring the living needs of its people, and between development and carbon reduction, and will achieve carbon peak and carbon neutrality within the time frame we set.
As the host of APEC 2021, New Zealand also says that governments must send the right signals to businesses and consumers to discourage the inefficient use of fossil fuels.
Why on earth are governments subsidising fossil fuel use to the tune of some $500 billion every year? I'm pleased that APEC is turning the tide on these subsidies by taking concrete steps to tackle them.
And APEC leaders will meet again virtually at their leaders' retreat this weekend. Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
The US President Joe Biden is expected to sign his infrastructure bill next week, Monday. Now, the $1.2 trillion spending plan includes money to invest in ports. He visited the port in Baltimore in Maryland outside Washington to tout the benefits of this legislation. He says it will ease critical supply chain bottlenecks. Owen Fairclough has this report.
US President Joe Biden came to the port of Baltimore with a vision for fixing three of America's biggest problems right now: supply chain bottlenecks, inflation, and upgrading America's infrastructure. And he thinks that by tackling all three, he can help all three problems. With that infrastructure bill, he wants some $17 billion to be spent on upgrading America's ports, essentially to make them capable of accommodating the biggest container ships that now crisscross the globe in this globalized economy. Yet many ships have been stuck in bottlenecks in places like Los Angeles. Biden's plan is to upgrade these ports so that they can accommodate bigger container ships and make the whole business of transporting cargo more efficient, and thereby reducing those supply chain bottlenecks. So that's one part of Biden's infrastructure plan, and he set out just how complex living in a globalized economy can be when supply chains start getting threatened.
COVID-19 has stretched global supply chains like never before, and suddenly, when you go to order a pair of sneakers or a bicycle or Christmas presents for the family, you're met with higher prices and long delays, or they say they just don't have any at all.
So Biden thinks that his infrastructure program can help curb inflation, but the reality is that the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, has much of the firepower when it comes to affecting interest rates and controlling inflation. The Fed has kept interest rates at near zero to help nurse the economy through the COVID-19 recovery, and it's likely to be under pressure now to raise interest rates to try to get a grip on inflation. That comes with its own pressures, mainly on consumers who've got used to those low interest rates during this COVID-19 period. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Baltimore.
Now to China's largest shopping festival, Double 11. The online shopping blitz kicked off earlier today. Alibaba and its counterparts like JD.com have stretched the one-day event to an 11-day promotion. Now, some platforms even started discounts and pre-sales in early October. These companies have toned down the promotions and have stopped early updates of the shopping figures amid a much stricter regulatory environment this year. Alibaba, in fact, was saying that their focus this year is eco-friendly consumption and supporting vulnerable populations. The event does remain top draw for merchants and consumers. Analysts expect only a minor increase in gross merchandise value this year, considering slowing retail sales and supply chain shortages. Now, as online purchases do gather momentum, retailers are exploring new ways of getting to their customers, like live streaming. For example, Dai Kai has this report.
Think of how viral TikTok has gone in the West. The buzz around live streaming e-commerce is only more dramatic in China. As hype reaches its climax around this time every year, is a virtual shopping spree, a Chinese version of Black Friday.
It's not even halfway through November and many online shoppers are already short of money. Most blame one of China's biggest online shopping events of the year, the Double 11, because nobody's giving up the chance of getting discounted items online.
Paying just a fraction of money as down payment, you can lock in discounts on products ranging from cosmetics to smart gadgets. Consumers can view the items through live streaming. That gives them a better sense of what they're paying for, which is why brands have been quick to get in on the action, adopting this model as an essential part of reaching customers.
I think it's a fast-growing trend, and I'm fully confident for the future of live streaming e-commerce. We raked in over 20 million yuan of sales volume per year via live streaming alone. From my perspective, it's not a matter of if the business will start streaming, it's just a matter of when.
Making virtual transactions both easy and entertaining makes live streaming e-commerce a tempting option for buyers and sellers, but is not without its downside.
I think one disadvantage of it is we can't directly showcase how exquisite our crafts and materials are. We imported leather and crystal from overseas, but these delicate elements can't be felt, as online shoppers can't touch them or try those shoes on themselves.
Many businesses are dipping their toes in the water for the first time, and there are tons of challenges left for them to figure out, such as outselling competitors, expanding market shares, or even just gaining a foothold in the arena.
It's hard to stand out indeed, but almost nobody would deny that the turnovers of the live streaming e-commerce are at record levels. With buyers afraid of missing out on bargains, retailers are not letting slip any chance of selling as much as they can.
Data shows that by the end of 2020, over 60% of internet users in China watch live streams, and almost 40% of them participate in online shopping events.
So far, the top-tier streamers in China are still taking a dominant market share in terms of live streaming e-commerce. That being said, in-house streamers are still an important part for businesses to support the sales, because they need ways to attract attention online and convert it into foot traffic in their brick-and-mortar stores.
Getting attention during a shopping festival is easier than it is on normal days. But even with this year's impressive pre-sales, analysts say businesses craving an online to offline conversion from Double 11 will still be a challenge. Dai Kai, CGTN, Chengdu, Sichuan Province.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. So Brent crude is our focus. It's fallen a fair bit today, down to around $82, $83 a barrel on Brent crude. But nonetheless, Brent is essentially up about 4.7% since the start of the quarter. Coffee prices, we're also keeping a close eye on that, given, of course, the damage that's been done due to adverse weather in a key producer like Brazil. $213.60 today. That's relatively close to the high of the year so far, around $216.05. Here's what's coming up next. Next, we'll introduce you to an artist in Somalia who's creating ornate jewellery from the bones of camels. Welcome back. Let's wrap up with a story of a Somali artisan, Musa Mohammed Oloso. He carefully sorts out through a massive pile of camel bones discarded by a slaughterhouse in Mogadishu. But he's looking for pieces that he can then convert into jewellery or beads to be used by fellow Muslims as they recite their prayers. To his knowledge, he's just one of 4 artisans in the country of 16 million who work with the bones of camels.
Somali artisan Musa Mohammed Oloso is 55 and he has endured hardships to keep his trade alive. In 2006, he was shot in the arm by the brother of the owner of the camel bone heap where he sifts for his material. Oloso makes art from the camel bones and he's not the first camel bone artisan to be targeted. In 1978, in one of Somalia's many periods of war and turmoil, dozens of craftsmen were killed in Mogadishu and another town by gunmen. And so for years, he carved his bones secretly at home and then took them to markets to sell discreetly.
My father taught me this work in 1976, and at that time, it was all done by hand. The business has developed since 1978, and we bought machines from abroad. We now work with these imported machines.
Oloso's strong hands and arms bear calluses and muscles from his work, but he says that doesn't have to be the case for his kids, whom he plans to teach the craft.
Our work used to be difficult in the past. Now the work is easy. I can work easily and quickly without the bruises. My kids will inherit these skills from me, just like I inherited them from my father. They have to follow suit. I do not want these skills to stop.
His clients are mostly government officials or wealthy Somalis living abroad. Just one of his painstakingly carved prayer beads can cost around $50 in a country where 7 in 10 people live on less than $2 a day. His clients, though, feel that the work justifies the price.
I bought this rosary bead because it's a high-quality rosary made of camel bones. What matters to me is the quality and not the price. I bought it for $50. I prefer this one to beads imported from other countries like China.
A 2019 US government study found that Somalia is home to the world's largest camel population, and pastoralism of camels and other livestock provides livelihoods for 60% of the population. For Oloso and his family, carving bones has been their main source of income for decades. They have so far invested nearly $5,000 to import machines from Italy to chisel and puncture the tough bones. He dreams of someday selling his work abroad. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
And on the day that Alibaba smashed its sales records for Double 11 yet again, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.